I am Pastor Joie Miller, and I want to welcome you to the Joie Miller Podcast. Today, we are talking about boundaries, establishing healthy lines in your life. And I'm excited to jump into today's topic. It's such a hot topic that we face especially in the Christian world, because how many of you know people think Christians should just let people do whatever they want to them? And if we live that way, although we should operate in love and want to go the extra mile, if we don't establish healthy boundaries, then people can oftentimes take advantage of us. We can be miserable. It can really affect us in an emotional and negative way. And, you know, I think about the Bible verse, Proverbs 4:23. It says, above all else, guard your heart, for out of it comes every other issue. And that's what boundaries are. It's really establishing a guard around our hearts, perimeter lines around our hearts. Boundaries actually teach people how they can treat you. They're cues that you give people on how they can treat you, whether it's emotionally or ask you for things that actually you set the tone in establishing what these relationships look like. And a lot of times we think that we are not in control of it. We think that we just have to be victim to what everybody else wants or expects from us, and that's just simply not true. There's a healthy way to live a Christian life, to still be kind and loving and set those boundary lines. You know, the negative ramifications of not setting boundaries is that you're constantly at the mercy of everybody else, that you're not living a life that is yours, that you know, even ultimately, that you're not even yielding to the lordship of Jesus Christ. You're letting other people rule and really dictate how you live your life. And so as we jump into today's topic, I want to ask you some questions. If you answer yes to some of these questions, it means that maybe it's time for you to set some healthy boundaries in your life. Number one is this: do your relationships tend to be difficult or dramatic? The relationships around you, are they difficult? Are they dramatic all the time? Because it's not how God intended it to be. A lot of times we come out of the relationships that maybe we've had in the world as Christians, and it's reestablishing what a Christian relationship, reestablishing what a relationship should in general look like, that there doesn't have to be filled with drama and chaos, that you can actually be at peace in your relationships, that our relationships can be life-giving. A lot of times if we're a person who hasn't set boundary lines, we easily get involved with these toxic relationships, almost a codependency where we get our worth or our value from somebody needing us or from some sort of drama or chaos. So are your relationships always dramatic or difficult? Number two is, do you find decision-making a real challenge? If so, you might need some boundary lines. Is it hard for you to be decisive, to make a decision? Are you always just ready to go with the flow or do what other people want to do? Number three, do you really hate to let other people down? This is a huge one. If you answer yes, you might need some boundaries. Are you a people pleaser? Will you do whatever it takes to make other people happy, even at the expense of maybe what you want to do or what you know you should be doing, or even at the expense sometimes of the people who really need you, like your family, your husband, your children? Are you afraid to let other people down at the expense of your own happiness? Do you always feel guilt or anxiety? Always feel guilt or anxiety? Are you always feeling guilty? Maybe if somebody asks you to do something and you say you can't, do you feel guilty about that? Even decisions down to maybe taking the last piece of cake or asking somebody to move down a seat so that you can have a place to sit. Those kind of little decisions, do they make you feel guilty or anxious? If so, maybe you need to set some boundaries. Let's see, are you constantly the victim of your situation? Do you always feel like people are taking advantage of you? Do you always feel like you're always the one left as the victim or the person who has had something done wrong to you? If so, you might need to set some healthy boundaries. Do you often wonder who you really are? Do you let other people define you? Do you let what other people think about you really set the standard for who you are and your opinions even about yourself? Well, if you answered yes to some of these questions, that might mean you need to really look at the word boundary lines. In general, we think of setting boundaries as a negative thing. And by all means, it can become negative. A lot of times in the world we live in, and the culture that we live in, if we don't like somebody or we get upset with someone, especially in a cancel culture, we just shut them off, we unfollow them on social media, we block them. And that's not necessarily what God has called us to do. He's called us to live in a way that we want to make peace with others, that there shouldn't be an area of animosity in our lives. And sometimes guarding our heart means setting up those safe boundaries to actually protect ourselves from the constant confrontation of that feeling of animosity in our lives. So there's a healthy way that we're not just canceling people out. There might be some people in your life that do need canceled, that you do need to put a hard wall up against. But for the most part, we can create healthy boundaries that we can live and coexist with each other. For example, if you feel like maybe there's a family member that you need to create a boundary line with, maybe the answer isn't cutting them off completely, but really establishing some new lines in your relationship so that your heart can be guarded. In my life, I know there were seasons in my life where I was like, God, I want to do what's right. And I want to have a relationship with this person because I know that is your desire for me. But every time that I encounter them, I feel like my heart's challenged and almost is hurt. And I remember the Lord speaking to me and saying, you know what, that's not how it should be. There are boundary lines that you can operate from, that you can love and operate in forgiveness from those boundary lines. Think about it. In the natural, you have property lines around your house. There's different limits in our lives that are actually for protection. And so I want you to look at creating healthy boundaries today as protecting our hearts, as protecting our relationships. And so point number one is this: in creating healthy boundaries and guarding our hearts, that sometimes you need to separate the issue from the person. Separate the issue from the person. For example, if there's a person in your life that you really love, a friend that you really love, it's difficult to create a boundary because of your love for that person. In our mind, we think to set a boundary is that we have to completely cut them out of our lives. But really, you can identify the issue that is the reoccurring problem and separate it from the person. When you do that, you can actually create a space or a boundary around that issue. Maybe that person's always domineering or tries to tell you what to do all the time. You need to identify what is it in our relationship that's actually causing me to feel tense, that's causing me to feel badly. See, all of our relationships are based off of experiential exchanges. So we have these relational exchanges that we make, and we take them as experiences. So when we're around a person, we either leave that engagement feeling like we had a positive or negative experience. And if you're around a person and it's constant toxicity, constant negative exchanges, it's time to step back and say, why is it that I feel this way? And you need to really identify, is it a them issue or is it a me issue? Because sometimes our hearts can be wounded because of something that maybe we're projecting onto that other person or we're taking on in our lives. That's why it's important to establish boundaries, because if there is a certain person in your life that is toxic to you and you don't establish that boundary, then we can start to look at everybody else through that lens, and it can really trickle into the other relationships in our lives in the perception of ourselves. So establishing that boundary, separating the issue, really identifying it. What is it? What is it that challenges my heart? What is it that makes me feel bad when I'm around that person? Separating that issue to really identify and focus on it is so important. To separate it and say, you know what, I'm going to step back so that I can get fresh perspective as to why this person or why this situation makes me feel this way. Is it because I feel out of control? Is it because I feel like they're belittling me or domineering me? Is it because I feel like they don't care about my emotions? Maybe you're being manipulated or taken advantage of. Maybe people are trying to control you by things that they say to you that solicit a certain response in your life. And you constantly maybe have that feeling of I just don't want to do this, but you do it anyway because you love that person. Establishing, separating, what does that situation look like, and what boundary line then needs to be established to keep it healthy in your life. Number 2 is this: establish your no. And I want you to really think about this, especially as a Christian, that it's okay to say no, that no is actually a complete sentence. You don't need a 3-page dissertation on why you can't watch your friend's kid today. Just no, I'm sorry, I can't today. And when you do it in love, when you communicate in love, as the Bible says, when you communicate in kindness, when everything that you say is filtered through 1 Corinthians 13, you have a complete leeway to say, no, I can't do it. It's your responsibility to protect your space, to protect your peace, to protect your joy, to protect your time. Nobody else is going to do it for you. But you have to give yourself permission to say no without excuses that follow it. You don't owe anybody an excuse. If you say, no, I can't do it today, that is enough. And knowing that that's not being unkind, knowing that people aren't always even going to understand that. But that's okay, because when you do it in love and you communicate in kindness, even if you're misunderstood, you're establishing that boundary line. And if you're in a relationship that you haven't established that boundary line, it might be uncomfortable at first. It might feel weird. That person might even maybe be taken back. But just be overly clear in your communication. It's not because I don't love you. It's not because I don't want to help you. I just can't today. I'm sorry. No. And when you do that, you free yourself up, that you're back in control of your life, your situation, your time. Now you can be obedient to what God has called you to do. There's been seasons in my life that I've tried to be everything to everybody, and I didn't have space for what I knew God was calling me to do. And in that moment, what felt like I was not being loving or serving, I was actually disobeying God and not giving him space in my life to do what he wanted to do, because I was so busy catering to everybody else. And if you're not careful, people will suck up your time. People will try to even maybe manipulate the situation. There's nothing worse than feeling like you don't have control over your own life. And the truth is, people don't like it when there haven't been limits set and you set limits to them. People don't like not having full access to you when maybe they have in the past. And it just might be you saying, no, I'm setting a limit here. I'm setting a boundary line, and I'm sorry that you don't like it. But you're teaching people. Remember, that's what boundaries are. They're teaching people how they can treat you. So when you say, no, you can't have my time, or no, I'm not going to be manipulated by that. See, in the natural, when people try to manipulate us, we want to please them, so they don't like that limit, so they'll try to talk our way in or make us feel bad about it. Oh, you don't love me, or you don't care, or you don't, you're not a family player. All of these things that they try to get us to back off of our boundary. But when we say, no, I'm reestablishing that, I give myself permission to say no. In my life, I give myself permission to set up that hard line that you can't cross. Then you start to experience true freedom. Then you can start to move in what God has called you to do. You can listen and hear God's voice and have confidence now that you're hearing clearly and operating out of obedience, not under manipulation, not under compulsion, not being dictated by what somebody else is thinking or doing in your life. Listen, if you're in relationships with people you haven't established boundary lines with that are toxic people, they will try to manipulate you. They will try to get you to give in. It's like if you were driving down the road and you couldn't steer the car, and you looked to the side and you saw somebody else riding beside you, and maybe they were a drunk driver and they were steering your car for you. That's what it's like, giving somebody else who's unhealthy permission to steer the course of your life. That's what manipulation is. It's giving them control over what you do. So maybe it's an extra needy person. Maybe it's someone in your life who has addiction, and you're constantly fearful that they're going to take their life, or constantly fearful that you're not going to do enough for them. You are not the savior of people. Jesus Christ is. If you have somebody in your life that is always demanding something of you, if the enemy has gotten into your thought process and taken you captive to fear that maybe if you don't do it, something bad is going to happen, you need to let that go today. You need to give it to God and say, God, I can't save them. You're the only one that can save them. I'm handing this over to you, and I'm setting a boundary line that I won't be manipulated anymore in my life. Giving yourself permission to say no. And then allowing time, number 3, to heal and become healthy. That's what a boundary line does, is it creates that space in your life that you're not attached to that negativity anymore, that you're not attached to that feeling of manipulation anymore, that actually you can separate yourself from it a little bit and you can have fresh perspective. When you create space around something, like we talked about in point number 1, separating yourself from the issue to get a better perspective, whenever you do that, you're creating space around that issue. And when you create that space, it gives you fresh perspective now, that you think more clearly. When you're not always having that experience where your heart's being challenged and you step away a little bit, now your mind can start to process things, not just from how you're feeling, but from a rational point of view. That now actually your brain's working on a different level because you're not constantly be challenged by all these feelings. But now you could start to say, you know what? I know why they're doing that. They're unhealthy. It's a them issue. It's not a me issue. Really having that space to heal and love them. Maybe it's a place that you're like, you know what? This is why that triggers me. Or this is why I always respond to this person in this way. And you have a fresh outlook and a fresh love upon that person, where before maybe you just felt smothered or resentful or bitter or always hurt. Now you have this space that I'm healthy. I can step back and I can see them through God's eyes. I can see why they're doing that. And now I can offer love to the situation, that I'm not a victim anymore, but now I'm stepping back and I'm receiving healing and wholeness, and I'm protecting my space. Listen, you owe it to yourself, you owe it to the Lord, and you owe it to the people who you love most to create those boundary lines. It's God's will that you have healthy relationships, that you remain healthy, and the relationships around you are healthy. And he sets up guidelines in his word that you would operate in love, that you would obey and serve the Lord first, that he would be your master, that you wouldn't be a people pleaser, that you wouldn't give in to the opinions of man. He set you up that you would thrive in the area of your relationships. So I want to challenge you today. Set healthy boundaries. What are the issues in your life that are reoccurring? What makes you feel like you don't have control in your life? What are the relationships that make you feel bad or confused? The enemy loves to work in confusion and chaos. Separate yourself, step back from them. Give yourself permission to say no, establish those hard lines, and then step back long enough to operate in love and allow your heart to heal. When you do this, you will see your relationships take off on a new level. You'll be more confident and ready to accomplish all that God has for you. Until next time on the Joie Miller Podcast, be blessed.